See applied behavior analysis in a different and refreshing light here at the Skinner Report. Hosted by Sara Litvak and Anna Bullard, they shed light on what ABA therapy organizations need to know to level up their behavioral health services, helping every individual with autism meet their maximum potential. Join information-filled episodes with leading industry experts as they discuss every issue and update in the ABA scene, giving you an idea of what you can do to become a quality ABA organization and support the building of inclusive and comfortable workplaces in this side of the healthcare world. Here are your hosts, Sara and Anna.
Welcome to the Skinner Report. Today, we are going to be talking about the legalities and ethics of layoffs and applied behavior analysis. I'm very excited to dive in today because we have an employment legal expert and attorney, Jackie, who counsels employers on employment-related issues and defends employment-related litigation. And Jackie, it's so nice to have you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, all. It's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I'm sure you want to give some legal disclaimers around the fact that this is not going to be legal advice, it's just your own opinion, but just maybe we can start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and your background and legal career, and we can dive in.
Sure. I sort of came right out of law school, getting lucky with the job in the employment-related field. It wasn't something I was looking for, but as soon as I kind of sunk my teeth into it, I found these sort of HR issues mixed with litigation, mixed with the employee, sort of counseling part of it very interesting. And I spent the first few years of my practice at a, large law firm, kind of nationwide law firm, and then switched over, as many attorneys do, to another law firm a few years later, practiced there for a while. And then for the last 6 years, I've been in-house at 3 different companies, sort of in different stages of growth, in different stages of M&A, and I've always kind of come in at times when they need a little bit of extra legal support for their HR and talent teams. And I've absolutely loved this practice and I love talking about it. So hopefully I can be of, some insight to you all today.
Yeah. And I just have to say too, it's funny. So Jackie and I know each other because we actually are neighbors. So we live down the street from each other and our daughters tend to do a lot of play dates. And I got really lucky that Jackie works for a Fortune 100 company. And, we've been talking about just layoffs in general over the last year or so. And so feeling like this is something that the industry's really been struggling with. And then hearing some of Jackie's wisdom over the last couple of months, it felt like it would be a great opportunity to mix personal and work. So thank you again. I guess maybe we can jump in quickly. We're here to talk about the legalities of layoffs. And then after we're done here, we're going to talk a little bit about the ethics around it. But I guess, can you tell us a little bit about sharing in your experience, like what are some of the drivers of layoffs within an industry? And I'll comment by saying we're going to talk about like what happened in the industry. I actually didn't tell you what happened. I just wanted to talk to you cold about the situation. But I would love for you to talk a little bit about, why layoffs happen. And then like from a general perspective, it's happening kind of all across the United States. It's not really industry specific right now. So maybe just jump in and give us your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, people always make jokes about employment lawyers. Like they're not maybe the sexiest or most exciting type of law, but it's always needed because people are always hiring and always firing. And I think at least for me, it's gone in seasons a little bit. I've seen things like a company doing a lot of, merger and acquisition work. When you buy a new company, you'll have to do some restructure. And that's a sign of kind of good economic times. There's some buying. But there are layoffs related to those. And I've certainly been part of those types of layoffs before. And then there's kind of the layoffs that are happening now, which is an anticipation and kind of a reaction to an economic downturn and just general uncertainty, I think, globally in the world, and even just the value of the dollar and what the stock market is doing, and companies trying to have their workforce in some way match what their revenue looks like. And obviously, a workforce is a huge, component on your balance sheet. So it's kind of a fast thing to be able to fix. So, that's kind of what I've seen working through. And then there's also just realizing how a company works best and having to restructure based on, what's making money and what's not. So sometimes you might have layoffs in one sector of your company while you're hiring like crazy in another. So it can kind of all happen at once. And I think, that's why sort of it's always something on an employment lawyer's mind, because it's, even if it's not in the news, it's sort of happening, whether or not, it's enough to make people read about it.
Yeah. And I was going to say, especially in our industry, I think there's a lot of confusion around what is the model that works. So in the kind of therapeutic world, there's organizations experimenting with a virtual workforce. There's organizations experiencing with clinic-based versus home-based. And so those are different types of people who want to work at a clinic versus want to go into a patient's home and work there versus want to sit behind their computer and do telemedicine. And so there is a lot of kind of confusion around which of these works, which of these do we want to invest in? And so, we've certainly seen some organizations that are kind of experimenting with one model, realizing it's not working and trying to shift to another. But I guess kind of with that in mind, is it always a kind of a sign that the organization is in distress? You talked a little bit about M&A being a driver of that, but do smaller organizations do layoffs? What have you found to be patterns across why these things happen?
Yeah, I mean, from maybe just having seen so many of them, I think it could be, in an M&A situation, it could be a sign that the company is has enough money to buy, has enough power to borrow, and they are just now taking an organization and sort of, if you absorb it, you're going to have some redundancies. And so that is very much a sign, I think, that a company is growing. And I had that happen at a company that was pre-IPO and eventually IPO'd. It was just part of our natural growth. And of course, small companies do layoffs. They just tend not to end up in sort of the WARN reports that you can find on the state websites because they don't trigger them. And even sort of getting to the question is what is a layoff versus just, kind of right sizing or restructuring. We kind of, under the law, they call it a mass layoff. It's, generally over 50 people, at least in California. But if you have a really small company and you lay off 10 people, that has a much bigger impact than a 500-person layoff at a 10,000-person company. And I would argue that that kind of tells you more about what's going on, with one company versus the other, because, it can be a pocket of a bigger company versus an entire company. It really depends.
Yeah. And I was going to say, candidly, I think, I've spoken about this, within the organization and a little bit kind of within the industry, but, just transparently, here at BHCOE, we recently had to go through a layoff activity as well. And it was probably one of the most challenging things I had to do, since COVID. But, there was a number of reasons for it. We're a pretty small organization, pretty lean, but, we had a new technology, like a digital transformation we went through, and we anticipated some efficiencies when we rolled it out, but we didn't realize just how many efficiencies we'd have. And so we realized that there was just one department where we were staffed by double, where we didn't need all those people. There just wasn't enough work for them. And so as someone going through that, like I said, we have less than 30 employees, and that's something that we had to, or less than 40 employees, we had to do that. And I totally agree. Sometimes it's more painful for a small organization than for a large organization to go through something like that.
And I think employees that maybe work at a larger organization have a mindset where they are not as shocked about it when it happens. Whereas when you work somewhere for longer or that's smaller, it tends to feel more secure. Whereas, at the end of the day, if you're an at-will employee, nothing is really, if COVID has taught us anything, when, none of us are kind of safe.
Yeah. And Jackie, I was just wondering, because we've seen, a lot of criticisms and even I think some positive feedback too, but what are some of the considerations from a legal perspective that an organization should consider when doing layoffs?
Yeah. I mentioned WARN, which is, there's a federal version of, sort of law that governs the type of notices that you have to give. But, once you get beyond WARN, the thing that I've been focusing a lot on, is sort of adverse impact. It's difficult when you're
Can you tell us what WARN is, just for those who aren't familiar?
It's the worker, what does it actually stand for? It's the
I just looked it up. The Worker Adjustment and Restraining Notification Act.
So the reason no employment lawyer will remember what it stands for is that doesn't mean really anything, but it's really, there's a federal version and then there are state specific versions, especially we think a lot about the ones in California and New York because they have different triggers, but it governs what type of notice you need to give to your employees. So in California, for example, if you terminate more than 50 plus employees, I believe it's in a 60-day rolling period. And that's regardless of the percentage of your workforce. So you can have 10,000 employees in or outside of California. Then you have to give them 60 days notice of the termination. And you have to give it in writing and you have to tell them certain things. It's kind of a short laundry list of things. And then you also have to, in California, send notices to the government, which is how we all find out about the larger layoffs, because you can look them up on the, California Warren's website. You could do the same in New York. New York has a lower threshold. I think it's like 25 employees, but it has to hit a 33% of your workforce cap. So it really doesn't give the employees anything other than notice. And a lot of employers choose to basically just pay out the employees for that period of time instead of having them work 60 days, because it's not always really feasible to give people notice and then have them stick around working for 2 months. So that's sort of, I think of that as the paperwork. There's not, much there substantively to do. But once you get past that, I think if the larger your organization is and the larger your layoffs are, you have to think about adverse impact on certain demographics. And that could include anything from, race, ethnicity. I've considered issues like what type of employee resource group or affinity group people are part of, because that doesn't always get caught up in race. Are we adversely impacting, people that are caregivers? Are we adversely impacting people over under 40? Just to make sure that when you look at the numbers, maybe the individual decisions were kind of made in a vacuum. You put them all together. What have you really done? Does the organization look similar before and after? So that's a lot of what I've spent my time doing, in the last, I would say 6 years, thinking about reorgs, is that you don't want to lessen your sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion inadvertently through a layoff.
I never thought about that. So that's an exercise that you will do. And I was just going to say, so then let's say a list gets put in front of you of like, these are the people considered for the layoffs. So then you may go back to the kind of executive team and say, there's too many people of this particular background, or you need to rebalance. Is that how that works?
It's a really good question. And I think what I've found in groups that I've worked with is that you kind of have to lay the groundwork in advance. So rather than saying, okay, pick in any way you want to pick who you're going to lay off, you try to go to each group and create some really sort of strong criteria, objective criteria for why are we, so if we're going to reduce each of these departments, let's say by 5%, what's going to be the criteria? And I've even gone as far as rating each employee to say, like, how do they compare against one another? Or how do they just meet each one of these criteria? And it can be criteria that are more hard skills. Like for me as a lawyer, it would be, years of experience or, sort of strength of my background in places that I've worked. And it could also be cultural values, like how strong are they showing up as a communicator, or how are they sort of leaning into, the various values of the company. And then that can, at times when you see that there's an imbalance, at least give you a framework to look at who's on the bubble, right? So you're not going to take somebody that scored super, super high and because of their protected characteristic or their age or whatever it may be, lay them off instead of somebody else. But you at least acknowledge that there's an additive value to people's differing, experiences and perspectives, so that if you maybe have two people that are close, you consider keeping somebody that is going to make your department or your group or your company as diverse as it was before you started a layoff. And 9 times out of 10, the data is showing you that things are okay because you've now laid the groundwork in creating criteria so that people aren't just choosing people for layoff that don't look like them or don't think like them, because they've been forced to decide what it is that's going to be required by this job post restructure, post layoff.
Interesting.
Such good information. It's
love a lot of work.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying, because basically to me, what I hear you saying is you have to put in a lot of work before. Right. These should not be quick decisions or made in haste or without a lot of thought to not just federal laws, but very state specific laws, and then all those other types of things. And I think that kind of leads us into the messaging part, Jackie. What are some things that can you talk to us about how you message these things in the right way, or maybe some examples of where that's been done well, or maybe, how a practice could best do that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it's such a personal thing. I've been reading about how CEOs handle it. And it's I think there's a bunch of Harvard Business Review, case studies about how people do RIFs. So I'm really eager to hear your perspective on this.
It's so hard because it's breaking up with a group of people and not saying anything to them about it until it happens. And even at the most transparent of companies and the ones that really lean in, I've seen messages, I've seen like the Airbnb, I think it was, had a really transparent message, but it was of course after the fact. And it went into specifics that I thought were so helpful. If I were an employee, that's what I would want to read. And if I was an investor, that's also what I would want to read. But they can't put that out until all the decisions have been made, which often, you can lay all the groundwork. But at my experience at the 11th hour, there's always some changes based on last minute things. And then people's privacy. So you really can't say anything to anyone until day of. So I think my general advice is you have to keep it really small, really quiet, but then have a very robust and transparent sort of communication plan for once you've pulled the trigger and everyone's been noticed. And my hat is off to communications teams that I've worked with that sort of have every contingency in place, because once you start the layoffs, depending on how many you're doing, people start talking to one another and it's like the cat's out of the bag and you can only wait so long.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to put out a message after 50% of the conversations have been had. And that's terrible for the people that haven't had those conversations yet. And for people that don't know if maybe they're going to be part of them, that kind of waiting game is excruciating. So it's a tough balance.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, out of curiosity, was looking up companies that announced major layoffs just in the past month. And it's pretty crazy. I mean, Ford laid off 8,000 employees in July. I was going to say Tonal and Peloton. I mean, Peloton had this like incredible growth, during COVID, and then they just laid off 2,000 people. Facebook laid off or Meta, I guess they're called now.
Yeah.
Rivian. I mean, it's like Twitter. I mean, the list really goes on. Tesla, Spotify, Netflix, Coinbase. I mean, it's a very long list. And so I'm hearing you say that, and I'm just thinking about the fact that like this is really like an economic phenomenon. Like you're dealing with a very volatile market. You're dealing with a fast growing economy that really got slowed down by the pandemic, where people are kind of holding on, and you're now seeing us kind of prepare for a recession. So it's definitely something that everyone is struggling through right now. But I agree that the messaging is so tough. In a small company, you can probably call each individual person and talk to them about it. But how do you handle this in like a digital world where like everyone's on Zoom or you're not like in a physical office space?
Yeah, that's...
Is this like a 500 person Zoom call? Is this like a one-to-one meeting with every person? Like,
So, I mean, I've seen it done both ways. I've seen situations where there's no way to get to 50 people. You just have to have, either one big meeting that's going to be a Zoom call and then sort of offer time slots for anyone who wants to talk afterwards. I've seen companies that are doing huge layoffs manage to get enough HR professionals together to do one-on-ones. The Zoom piece of it is a double-edged sword because you can kind of pop a meeting on somebody's calendar and be more sure that they're going to see it and that they're going to attend it. And, but I've also been part of a lot of contingency planning for people that are on vacation or on leave or, have some other reason why you just don't think they're going to attend. And in normal circumstances, you'd probably be able to plan at least where they are in the world. But now, even with remote work, sometimes you're not even sure where somebody is working from. I think it's just a matter of how much work and resources you're able to put into it. The best situation is, of course, always going to be a one-on-one where that employee can kind of have their reaction, gather themselves, and then have a conversation with HR where all of those immediate sort of scared questions start to come out. If this were to happen to me, that I would want somebody there to explain like, what's going to happen to my benefits? Like, when do those end? When's my last paycheck? How do I enroll? What does Cobra cost? Like all these sorts of like, how am I going to plan for the next few months kind of questions, which don't happen on a 500 person Zoom call.
Right. Yeah. And I was going to say, so maybe it makes sense to switch gears and talk a little bit about specifically what's been going on in this industry, because I know you're in a different one. I can just like read you some headlines of like, what these articles have been saying. There's a trade publication called Behavioral Health Business that kind of just, it's like, I don't know, like the Variety magazine of the entertainment industry that kind of it kind of talks about what's going on, what the trends are. Some of the information in there is accurate. Some of it is, based on like, they cite social media and stuff. So you kind of always have to fact check these articles. But I think there was one on July 18th that said 360 Behavioral Health, CARD, which is a Center for Autism and Related Disorders, downsize as mass layoffs hit autism providers. And it does cite like, a lot of social media posts revealing a sweeping trend of staff reductions across autism service providers. In both cases, the article cites the fact that the reimbursement rates from the payers that they have contracts with are just unsustainable. And so it required them to shut down certain locations. So for CARD, for example, they shut down just their entire Oregon operations because they were having some trouble with the funder in Oregon. So they kind of notified all the employees, according to this article, that all 10 of its Oregon centers are going to be closed. So it would be 156 layoffs. And it was in the Warren report. So obviously that got picked up. And so, I think what's unique about this is that typically in a large organization, these things happen. And I remember when Peloton did their layoffs, I'm in LA and I have a lot of colleagues who just either know someone who worked at Peloton or worked at Peloton. And so my LinkedIn feed was blowing up with people being like, I'm so sad. Today's my last day at Peloton. And, love all the people I work. It was a very positive, I just remember it being very positive about the layoff situation. And here, my LinkedIn feed is F these people. It's very negative and it's and so I'm kind of just curious. So that's kind of one thing that's going on. And we're not even talking about the impact on the patients, right? We have not gotten there. We're going to talk about that, around the ethics piece. But in one situation, the allegations are that one of the large providers named LME, their SoftBank backed company, laid off a number of people with very little notice. The allegation is no patients were notified ahead of time. They just didn't get therapy that day. And so in these cases, you're seeing just a lot of animosity on social media. And I kind of am just curious, talk to us a little bit about the people element, because I think obviously I care a lot about the patients that are impacted, but these people oftentimes are hourly workers, right? So they're not executives like you see sometimes in the layoff. They're not salaried people. They're people who are getting paid a living wage, and that's their livelihood. But how have you seen people kind of react to layoffs? And what do you think is a natural reaction to this sort of thing?
What I want to say is that it's how you handle it that changes the person's perspective on the layoff. But I have to say, I think no matter how hard myself or any of my HR colleagues try, I think the way that you react to a layoff, if the layoff is done compassionately, is more reflection of your sort of tenure and time at the company as a whole. I think people probably enjoyed working at Peloton when they did. And when it was over, they kind of felt well, that was a wild ride and this will propel me into some other job. Maybe they got a severance. Maybe some of those people didn't feel kind of that same kind of burn. How am I going to feed my kids tomorrow? Maybe it was just more this is a different shift in my career. But again, it's probably how they felt about their work. Whereas maybe people who are sort of more spiteful immediately as a result of the layoff also maybe didn't feel as valued or respected throughout their time at those companies. And that's kind of a speculation, but I've sort of seen people be very gracious about decisions that were really hard to make, really people didn't want to see that person go. And they've been so gracious about it. And then I've had other situations where the person could see the writing on the wall. If they weren't going to be laid off in this layoff, they were going to be laid off for performance another time. And They are livid. They are so mad. They are, I deal with all of, post layoff demands and all this types of stuff that comes up. And it's really a reflection more, I think, of that person and of how they felt throughout their employment. And I'm sure. I think also there's just been such a tight labor market for the last year or two that people have had their pick a little bit. Their employees were in a position of power until honestly just feels like a month ago.
Yeah.
And it's still a pretty tight labor market because the layoffs haven't kind of absorbed.
Haven't kicked in yet. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So it's kind of a weird place where things are just happening so fast in the last 3 years that I think people are having whiplash from that as well.
Well, and that's what I was going to, add to, Sarah, because what we've seen is there are these mass layoffs happening, but to Sarah's point, in certain locations based on certain circumstances, but then that same company may be hiring in another location and everyone seems to be mad about that. I should say everyone, that's a generalization, but a lot of people are maybe mad or confused and just not considering the market dynamics, right, of what's occurring. But I have seen that going on too. And I think that just creates an interesting dynamic for companies, larger companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I agree about the kind of feeling of what it was like working there. I don't want to pretend the way we had to handle it, our organization was perfect by any means, but I know we definitely took the time to give people adequate notice. I personally tried to place people reached out to our network to place them in other roles for those who wanted it. Obviously, not everyone wanted it. Some people wanted to figure it out themselves, but we kind of did our best to do that, all things considered. But I think it's a lot harder when you're dealing with a high volume. And I think the other part too, that I don't think you're aware of, Jackie, is we've had a large amount of private investment come into our industry. So it used to be kind of privately owned mom and pops that were mostly servicing this population. And then you recently had the likes of like Blackstone and KKR and TPG and SoftBank coming in. And a lot of those organizations have brought in these, career CEOs who worked for, Fortune 500 companies or worked for these more corporate organizations. And, some of the feedback that we've been seeing is more that they're handled like corporate layoff, right? Not like the small mom and pop kind of cottage industry that it used to be. And I think that's the other part too, is, whether people like working somewhere or not, a lot of these executives are coming in and using the past experience to create a riff in a way that maybe isn't speaking to the emotions of the people who are used to having a more personal touch.
Absolutely. I mean, when a company hires me, I think before they meet me and actually know sort of the way I operate, I'm often a telltale sign of new guard, right? Companies don't have an employment lawyer in-house until that sort of private equity money comes in and they no longer want to see the types of compliance risks that a smaller organization was willing to take. So I see that a lot. And I think, it can be handled regardless of private equity money. There's always a place for compassion and for personalization. And that's sort of, what I think.
Yeah.
People need to remember that they can still do what's needed to be done. It doesn't have to look like, sort of an ambush all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So true. And that's something I always, when I worked for an ABA company that was private equity backed, I still said that about our families, right? About the services we provide. It doesn't matter if we're private equity backed or not. How we treat families should still feel personal, that we care, that they should feel like this is the only place that we own. It's the same. What you're saying is the same. And I love that, because what you're saying, everyone can do. And I think that's why it's so meaningful.
Absolutely. I mean, we're all employees. So I think the empathy is just there. You have to think how I think about it every day, unfortunately, because of just, I'm dealing with terminations of all different stripes. So I'm just constantly having a soul searching about what it is that I would want if I was in a particular situation.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's a very good experience to have in your life to be terminated from a role. Personally, I don't know, Jackie or Anna, if you've ever been. I've certainly been fired, in my day. Yeah. Oh, you have. Anna, have you been
First
fired?
job as a hostess, fired 2 months in. I was terrible.
Oh, I've definitely been fired early on. I actually do think it was a restaurant. I was working in a restaurant, and it was a good call on their part. This is not my forte, guys.
Personally, I feel like it was a great experience. I remember feeling all right, this is good. But it gives you good insight into kind of how it's done, some growth areas for yourself. I think growth, some good feedback about how you can do things better. And I have found it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I found people who've said they've gotten fired. It's one of the best things that's ever happened to them, because it allowed them to kind of rethink their journey and figure out what they want to do. I think not related to employment law, but my worry is with all these workforce reductions is you had all these people who were really excited about servicing this population. We have a labor shortage, right? So you have all these kids with autism that can't get treatment. And then, you were having 500 employees who were dealing with this very vulnerable population. They get fired. And my worry is half of them probably don't want to work in the industry anymore, right? They're sober to the fact that they're well, this isn't for me. Let me switch career paths. So I think that's my concern is I think it hopefully can help people rethink where they want to work, what values exist in the company they're working for. You got individuals who are getting paid well above market value at some of the organizations that are doing layoffs. And so getting an idea of you may have been chasing the shiny object versus going to an organization that may be paying at market rate, but the longevity may be a little bit longer too.
Yeah.
Anna, do you have any other questions? I think this is a good update on our end. We're going to be talking shortly here about the ethics piece. We talked about the legalities, and we're going to have Jon Krieger come on and talk a little bit about kind of the market dynamics in the transaction space. So we'll hopefully get at this layoff situation from a couple different angles in this episode. But thank you, Jackie, so much for your time and for your insight and expertise.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
I am so excited. I have Jon Krieger with me today. from the Calex group to talk a little bit about some of the trends we've seen in the ABA market over the past 6 months or 7 months. So Jon, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, Sarah, it's good to be here as always.
Last time we had you on the podcast, it was January of 2022. You were kind of talking about like what happened in the prior year. You told us a little bit about like what the expectations would be for 2022. And we're now sitting here looking in the rearview mirror, just thinking about, the first half of 2022. So would love your take on what's going on in the market right now. Like what significant acquisitions have happened? Like what's activity been like?
Yep. Well, look, I think, last year was a record year for M&A in general. And so it was a very high bar to live up to. And then, when you take that in conjunction with the volatility in the overall financial markets that we've seen in the first half of the year, in particular in the credit markets, there's been a real slowdown in M&A in general. And, that has impacted the autism services sector as well as every other sector out in the marketplace. But look, I think, there still has been a significant amount of consolidation in the space in the first half of this year with some very relevant transactions. For example, ChanceLight sold its behavioral health business, which was a platform acquisition for a financial sponsor. Enhanced Equity made a platform acquisition in the first half of the year, as Investment 360 did in Cadian. And we've seen a number of add-ons from a lot of the larger platforms, for example, Health Pro, Acorn, Hopebridge, Learn, Stepping Stone, Circle of Care have all been acquisitive in the first half of the year. And so while you see somewhat of a slowdown relative to the same period last year, it still has been one in which, we've seen a decent amount of activity in the space.
Yeah. And I was going to say, so like when I'm hearing you name all of those are all ones that I'm familiar with. And, it's looking like around 9 transactions happen in the first quarter, maybe 3 in quarter 2. And before we get into like those trends and the slowdown that I think everyone's very aware of, I guess if you're a business owner or like an executive and you're not going through a sale, you're not private equity owned, you're not going through a transaction, like why should you care about the trends in the marketplace?
Well, I think, trends in the marketplace, both on the operational side and maybe you're referring to on the M&A side, are just relevant to the extent as consolidation continues to occur in a very, very nascent market. And a lot of entrepreneurs are building businesses, as are, sponsors who have made platform investments in the businesses or building businesses for future exits, right? So just to understand the cadence of the M&A market and the interest is really important. I think if you take a step back, what's really important for those people that you're mentioning to recognize is that, there's a lot of volatility going on right now within, all markets in general. And the autism services space is not insulated from some of the challenges, such as the labor issues that are pervasive in every other sector across the economy. But what's really important to also recognize is that this is a sector that remains unique and highly attractive on many different levels as it relates to its scale, its white space, its demand drivers, growth vectors, and overall secular tailwinds. They're all very differentiated from most, if not all, other sectors throughout the economy. And we're seeing this in the M&A markets as we speak in real time. And so I think it's important to recognize that, as you look at the industry and just how attractive it is from an investor standpoint and from an M&A standpoint, just given a lot of those characteristics that are differentiated from most other markets.
And I was going to say last time we saw this few transactions in a quarter was quarter 2 of 2020, where COVID was really at its height. What do you think is happening right now that's making that slowdown happen? Granted, there's just a general economic slowdown. I think like cash is more expensive. It's harder to raise capital, but is it anything that's indicative to the field, or do you feel like it's just a broader economic reaction?
I think the primary driver is that it's the broader economics that are happening throughout the economy. And I think that's the primary driver. But as I alluded to before, I mean, the industry, as every other consumer or retail market, is somewhat challenged from the supply constraints within the market. And if you take a step back and, you look at how strong the demand drivers are in the space, it's always resulted in a supply and demand imbalance that has really only accelerated over the last 12 to 18 months, given the labor issues that every other market is experiencing. And so, it has created somewhat of a difficult operating environment, to meet the demand levels within the marketplace. And, it's resulted in, a relatively nascent market, which is now, slowly starting to define some winners and losers, highlight, the importance of leadership teams and infrastructures and the ability to recruit and retain a workforce and to build a culture where people want to be part of. And so, I think it's a combination of economic factors in general, and I think that's the primary driver for the slowdown in the marketplace, a very high bar from last year, which was a record year of M&A, and then some of the supply logistic issues that this space and every other one is facing as well.
So you're touching on a really important point, which is that there's kind of this labor shortage that everyone's experiencing. So how do you reconcile that labor shortage with a large number of organizations going through layoffs? You talked about the Investment 360 acquisition of Cadient, and I know Cadient went through a round of layoffs, and then you have other organizations that mentioned earlier in this episode that have been doing layoffs. So how do you reconcile that? On one hand, we have a labor shortage, and then on the other hand, you have organizations who are doing mass layoffs of their clinical staff.
Yep, that's a good point. And therein lies the contradiction, right? Because, these labor issues that are pervasive throughout the industry and the economy in general, yet you have companies laying off their labor supply, right? And I think it just highlights that the labor issues that are happening now are working themselves through the system. They're more temporary than structural or systemic. And, again, the difficult operating environment has raised, a pretty bright light on companies' strategies, leadership teams, and ability to operate in, what is a somewhat complex marketplace, right? And, companies that didn't necessarily have the right infrastructures or haven't been built to meet the demand and undergo some of the cyclicality within the system, haven't navigated as well as others. But it's a good point, and I think it's illustrative of, how important focus and leadership and infrastructure is within this space. And, it's pretty binary. When you don't have those things, it's a much difficult operating environment for people to navigate.
So you are in a unique position because from your vantage point, you get to really dig into each of these businesses that you help go through a transaction. So you're really in the nitty gritty. You get to see the financials. You get to see, you open the hood and you really know what's going on. What have you seen as the differentiators? You have organizations in similar regions of similar scale who are not going through layoffs. And then you have others who are. What do you think are the determining factors across the two that are providing care to the same patients? Why are some organizations doing it, others not?
I think the ones that you see that, have momentum in this marketplace relative to others that don't, you can attribute it to great leadership teams, experience within this space and other multi-site verticals. I think leadership, infrastructure investment, the ability to build a culture where your providers want to work. If, those companies that have those characteristics, as well as, a very well thought out strategic plan, whether it's building market density in certain areas, but I think it's the focus that these companies have and the leadership that they bring to bear has been a real differentiator and is helping to really define and create a gap between, those that don't have it and perhaps are struggling and laying off employees now, and those that are capitalizing on those trends and accelerating their hiring trends to come out of this, a much stronger organization.
And I was going to say, I agree with you about the leadership piece, but do you also feel like there's an approach to wage inflation that some organizations are leaning into and others? I know at some point you had players coming in who were paying over market price for clinicians and then finding like down the road that those rates really don't sustain. And then the clinicians are the ones accepting it, right? Going after the shiny object and saying like, I'm getting paid, $10 more than I would over here, but now going through layoffs because that rate doesn't quite sustain. Are you noticing any of that as well? Or do you feel like it's really just based on the culture?
No, I think you see some of that as well. I think, the more thoughtful organizations that have a well thought out comp structure and, the ability to offer providers room to grow within an organization and be the provider of choice, right? Because a lot of these BTs and BCBAs and RBTs, have a lot of choices of where they could work. And I think having a very well thought out culture, recruitment strategy, retention strategy, and comp strategy really, really matter. And, anytime you're seeing it in the broader economy where you have a contraction of the labor force, right, where demand exceeds supply, you'll see some margin compression. And whether that's temporary or permanent remains to be seen. But those leading organizations, just given the demand drivers in the space and the volume, can offset somewhat margin compression by, being the provider of choice and differentiating themselves on many different levels. One not in particular, but one that could be important, is wages.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your insight. I always have to ask you this whenever we talk. So feel free to let us know your thoughts here. But some of these transactions that are happening, are the multiples maintaining? What is the market looking like right now? I mean, there's one thing to say the transactions are continuing to happen, although slower. But I think the big question a lot of business owners have too is, are they driving value like they used to?
Yep. Yeah. And I would say they definitely are. I think there's a scarcity value of market leaders, but I can tell you those companies that have differentiated themselves are commanding multiples that are consistent, with the history of this space and are very, very attractive. And I think, if you look at companies that are trading now relative to where they've traded 5 years ago, I would say multiples remain consistent and attractive. But I would also say that buyers remain, more focused on diligence and perhaps are a little bit more disciplined in their processes and deciding which processes to spend time in and which not to. But I can tell you that there is, a big cohort of investors that have and still have a strong thesis within this marketplace and are looking for differentiated platforms to underwrite and back.
Thank you so much, Jon, for coming on here. Always appreciate Calex Partners giving us your insight about what's going on in the industry. And we'll hope to have you back at the end of the year to do a wrap up of how we netted out for 2022.
Sounds good, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
All right, Anna, we just had an awesome conversation with really knowledgeable attorney. We heard from Jon Krieger about kind of market dynamics. And I thought we could just take some time to wrap this episode up by talking a little bit about the ethics piece around layoffs, specific to, clinical codes, standards, things like that. We talked a lot about the legalities and some of the dynamics at play, but I guess I would just ask you as a parent, what's kind of on your mind, understanding that these layoffs are occurring and knowing the clinical world, what are your main concerns around some of these actions?
Yeah, Sarah, I think, as a parent who, when Ava was diagnosed, it was a struggle to get her access to care. And there's still a lot of parents that are in that same situation on wait list. So I think for parents, it's very unsettling because you already, maybe you're on 3 different wait lists, or maybe you live in an area like I do where there's really not access to care. So you have to drive. And so when you start, seeing things in the news or on Facebook that are going to contribute to potentially you having to wait longer, it gets very frustrating. And I think a lot of parents probably that's what they're thinking about. Does this mean I'm going to wait longer? Does this mean my child's never going to be able to access ABA services? And if you're a family who lost your clinician, trying to find a new provider is very stressful after you've, engaged with this clinician. And it's obviously a very personal therapy, right, Sarah? Because you're getting,
Sure.
If you're getting early intervention, you're talking about 30 hours of someone in your home.
Yeah, you're building a rapport with these people.
Yeah.
And you get comfortable with them. It's funny because
Right.
we just spent all this time talking of the employee rights and things like that with the WARN Act. But I think the clinical implications or the ethical implications are more around access to care and continuity of care and making sure that, these patients are transitioned appropriately. And I think I would say if you're an organization that's considering layoffs or someone who has, I know when I think about BHCOE standards, there's a number of standards that I think we should be considered when conducting layoffs. And I would say, we haven't put out a formal position on this topic, but I would say openly that our position is that BHCOE expects all accredited organizations to make decisions in line with our standards of excellence for ABA services. And there's just a good variety there. I don't want to read all of them off word for word, but Section A deals with ethics and professionalism, and there's 2 items specifically, one around the organization acting in the best interest of the patients that they serve at all times. And the other one is just acting honestly and responsibly to promote ethical practices of its staff and making sure that certified staff aren't in a place where they're having to compromise their compliance with their ethical and professional requirements. So I think those 2 on its own are so important to consider, aside from the legal component of protecting, employee rights.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, Sarah. And so what is BHCOE doing? I know, I'm not so involved on the accreditation side, right? With the evaluators and, complaints that might come in through our hotline. And obviously those can come from, providers, from parents. And I know we have a very specific process to respond to that. But just, for everyone listening, what is our response to the recent layoffs? How do we respond to that?
Great question, and one that we've gotten a lot of inquiries about. I would say on a broader level, as I mentioned, our assumption is that organizations that are accredited are held to our standards. And so when something like this happens, it's really important that BHCOE enforces adherence to those standards that we've already evaluated organizations against. And so we're really lucky. We have a very robust compliance process in order to do that. And so when BHCOE receives a compliance complaint to our compliance department, when that comes in, we can either follow with the complaint directly, or if something very public happens, like in the recent events, we can also choose to open an internal complaint against the organization. And the department follows a very strict set of guidelines around our disciplinary process to ensure that there's equal consideration for the complainant and the organization. And our goal is really to remediate any issues. So for example, if an investigation occurs and we found that the continuity of care, the kind of transfer wasn't done appropriately, the goal is to go back and ensure that the organization makes adjustments to ensure that the appropriate course was taken. The disciplinary process is meant to assist organizations in remedying those areas. So the goal is not to slap anyone on the wrist. The goal is to really get them to compliance. But depending on the severity of the complaint, the compliance department may bring the compliance concerns directly to the provider's attention right away, or they could actually process the complaint and bring it to our disciplinary review system. And our disciplinary review system consists of a disciplinary review committee. We call them our DRC. They're a group of independent BCBADs who serve in a leadership role at our accredited organizations. And those individuals are part of organizations that have no open compliance concerns themselves. And typically we reach out to the organization, we ask for documentation, supporting documentation to kind of respond to the complaint. We then send that to our disciplinary review committee and host a meeting with the DRC in which they all it's a jury of peers, right? Where they look at the response and they determine the best course of action and whether there was an actual violation against that allegation. And in some cases, accreditation can be suspended or revoked. So, revoked just means that you're no longer accredited. Suspension usually has some course of action required that we're looking for an organization to make. But in all of these cases, that's why it's so important that an accreditor has a compliance process in place, because these things, if they happen, I'm always just grateful when something like this happens and the organization is accredited, because if they are and they handled everything perfectly, the organization really has a way to point back to, hey, we had an independent review and we really did what we needed to do correctly. And if they were out of compliance, then there's recourse for the families or for the staff members, and we're able to coach them to compliance. So it's really win-win. If the provider had, no issues at all and handled everything perfectly, we will commend them on that. But if they did find areas of remediation, then we kind of assist them in getting to where they need to be.
Wow. It's so amazing. Every time I hear the intricacies that go into accreditation, it's just so valuable to me. And I think about that again from the parent perspective. If I'm a parent and I'm at an organization that maybe there are concerns, or maybe other people are raising questions about, if they're an accredited organization, I'm going to know that these things are being taken care of. Right. And I think I love what you said about our goal is always to get people, on the right path. And I think that's so critical. Audits that I've been a part of, in the past with Department of Education and various things, those are your best audits when your auditor is working with you to make sure that you know how to change things for the future. I love that. It's fantastic. And I think all of these things are just so critical right now for our field and for our families. So yeah, Sarah's awesome.
I agree. Yeah. And I was going to say, I think going back to kind of some of the standards we look at, AO1 and AO4 are certainly the ones that are consideration, but there's also standards related to the organization making reasonable efforts to fulfill the therapy hours recommended by the patient clinical assessment, or that they have very clear discharge planning. And then I think the piece that's important too is that you never want to put your clinical staff in a position where they're going against their ethics code. And most clinicians are held to the ethics code for behavior analysts. And there's kind of a couple code items, 3.14, 15, and 16, that talk about facilitating continuity of service, appropriately discontinuing services, and appropriately transitioning services. And so in all of these cases, you want to make sure that the clinicians that are employed by your organization are in a position to follow through on their ethical commitment to their patients, to make sure that they consider a number of factors when discontinuing the service, or that they're making appropriate efforts to manage the transition, right? Like you're writing a written plan, you have target dates, transition activities, all of that in place. So these are all the things that I'm really looking forward to our disciplinary review committee to review and, make sure that if any of these things weren't done, that those patients are appropriately remediated. And if they were, then that's great as well. And, it's just an unfortunate time for patients and staff members impacted by these things.
Yeah, Sarah, let me throw out at you scenario, because I think I've heard obviously the challenge right now with finding staff and just the impact that that's having on everyone. And so if you have a situation where you're serving a family and then you lose one of your RBTs that's serving that family and you have no one to replace that RBT with. And so there's this situation, right? It's not like you have someone in your back pocket, right? That you could say, oh, well, let, this RBT now take those 20 hours. So I think, to me, I think about those types of challenging situations that I know organizations are facing right now that are literally, it's a very difficult situation to be in.
Sure. Well, and I think also the kind of ethics code for behavior analysts, it sounds very serious, right? It's an ethics code, and ethics is a very serious topic. But I think that, any ethicist or like ethical textbook will tell you that there's so many gray areas in the code, right? Because of course we want to account for the fact that in that case, you would magically have another RBT to just replace that RBT.
Right.
And there's no gap, but that's just not the reality of how these things work. So in all those cases, you just want to make sure that you've demonstrated the effort to fill the gap and that you're kind of working actively. And it also, we have really great webinars on this, but like, that's why you also need an active funnel of talent pipeline, and why you need like recruiting and hiring strength within your organization as a core competency. And a big part of our accreditation standards look at whether that exists within your organization, because what you don't want to do is like, and essentially be caught with your pants down, right? Where, you have people leaving and you're like just looking around trying to figure out like, how do you backfill this? So most successful organizations constantly have an open pipeline of staff that they're hiring to account for some of these things.
Yeah, great point. I think that is such a key role in ABA organizations, and it can be a role that is really undervalued in the sense of just having that consistent pipeline of RBTs and BCBAs is so critical because, there is a lot of turnover. We have tons of data, right, at BHCOE on that can help organizations really understand from a data standpoint how many clinicians that you really should be thinking about hiring month over month based on the data that you can see is turnover, especially within that technician position for sure. Yeah. It's very interesting, kind of the dynamics of what's happening now. It's almost like a perfect storm, with all of these things that are, with the combination of some of the federal and state laws related to telehealth being changed and altered, not as flexible as they used to be, or not covering certain codes that they used to. And then obviously with the resignation situation and all of that, I think it's a challenging environment. I, for one, want to just say, I so appreciate all the ABA organizations out there that are sticking it out for all of our families that need services, right? I know it's a very hard time right now, but I cannot say thank you enough to those organizations who are really just digging in.
I could not agree more. I know all of our organizations in one shape or form are struggling in some way. And I've said this before, it's a really tough time to lead right now. It's a really tough time to manage people. There's a lot of uncertainty. And so I feel the same way. It's such an important job. And Anna and I would love to hear from all of you. If you have any thoughts on the layoff situation that's going on across the industry and just, globally, feel free to email us at tsr@bhcoe.org, the Skinner Report. And we'd love to get your thoughts, and we'll read some of them out maybe in the next episode. And if you have anything that you want to share with us around, what you might know about any of these situations, feel free to do that as well. We're always ears to the ground trying to figure out how we can help support organizations like yours. So yeah, thanks, Anna, for your time. And, it's a tough conversation to have, but an important one.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
That's it for today's episode of The Skinner Report. By allowing yourself to be inspired and educated through this podcast, you are now one step closer to growing, building, or starting your own ABA practice that can impact the behavioral landscape. Continue nourishing your heart and mind right here by listening to more of our episodes at bhcoe.org. Be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a positive rating. Let us make the ABA scene safer, more caring, and more connected than ever before. Thank you for joining us. See you on the next one.